I recently picked up a Fuji XT-4, and today I'm going to tell you about my very first day shooting with the camera. So let's get right to it. What's up, everybody? My name is Pete Coco. I am a photographer with a studio in New York, and in today's video I want to tell you about my very first day shooting with the Fuji XT-4. Now, this is not going to be a comprehensive review. This is more of a first impressions review, and I'm going to tell you what I like and dislike about the camera and what it was like shooting with a brand new camera with zero experience using it on the first day. Now, I purchased this camera really as a backup to my Canon R5, which is my primary camera that I use for all of my professional work. It might seem weird to have a Fuji system as a backup when my primary system is a Canon system, but I have reasons why I wanted to do that, and I'll probably go over them in a different video. Before we get started, do me a favor, hit the subscribe button, hit the like button, and let me know what you think about this video in the comments, and let's get to it. Now, I can't think of a better way to test a Fuji camera than by doing some street photography. So a couple of my photographer buddies and I recently went into Brooklyn and spent the day, and I put the camera through its paces. Now, we started our day around 2 o'clock in the afternoon at Atlantic Terminal, and we basically walked towards and to the Manhattan Bridge and then the Brooklyn Bridge. So I was able to test the camera out in daylight, and it was sort of an overcast day because, you know, it's winter time now. And then I was able to test the camera in complete night. And I was very pleasantly surprised with a lot of the things that I found out. Now, I'm using the camera with a 35 1.4, which is the older lens, which does make a difference in the autofocus, and I'll talk about that later. And my other lens that I brought with me is the 16-55 f2.8, which is an awesome lens, and the autofocus is really good on that lens with this camera. But these were primarily what I used. As it got darker out, you know, I really did just put this 16-55 away, and I shot primarily with the 35 1.4 because I really needed that extra light that the 1.4 gave me. First and most important thing I want to talk about is the autofocus system. Now, as I said, I'm shooting primarily with an R5. So I really had what is the best or one of the best autofocus systems on the market right now to compare to this camera. And now, obviously, it's not a fair comparison because the R5 is a full-frame camera. Canon has really some of the best autofocus technology out there. But I felt like it was a good place for me to start because I know what that kind of top-of-the-line autofocus should be like. And then I could see, well, what have I sacrificed, if there is a sacrifice, going with the Fuji camera. Now, if I was going to give the AF just an overall grade from 1 to 10, and we're talking still photography now, I'd say it's probably like an 8 out of 10. I was really pleasantly surprised with how good the autofocus was in most circumstances. Now, keep in mind that this 35-1.4 is a much older lens. It's one of the first X-mount lenses, so there will be a noticeable difference in the focusing time between this older lens and something that's one of the newer lenses, or even something that's still got a few years on it but is much newer, this 16-55. And so let me talk about those two things separately. With the 16-55, the camera focuses really well. The autofocus works great. And I have an X Pro 1 that I've used as my primary street photography camera for family use. And there's obviously a night and day difference. I would say that in basically all situations with the 16-55, the focus works really well. And even in dark, less contrasty subjects, it locks on immediately. I had no trouble at all achieving great focusing results with the 16-55. With the 35-1.4, there is definitely a difference. It's not as good. But having said that, I still found that more or less the 35 did an admirable job. The focusing works really well with the XT4. Maybe there was 1 or 2 times throughout the day and night where the camera didn't really lock on the way I wanted it to, which was slightly frustrating, but it certainly was really good. It did an awesome job. So I was very happy with it overall. Now, I think one of the other reasons why people critique Fuji autofocus systems has more to do with the interface than the actual speed of the focus. So I find that the interface on the autofocus system in this camera is a little bit clunky when compared to the Canon. Even just the way that the focusing squares look and how they move about in the frame when you're trying to compose, it's not as seamless. So I think that might be part of what kind of detracts from the user experience. Now, what I did is I set it to continuous and I set it to tracking. And I find that that combination works really, really well for street photography. Now, if you've watched some of my other videos, I did a video on the autofocus system in the R5, and it really changed the way that I shoot, because up until the R5, I never bothered with shooting in continuous. I would always keep it in one shot. And so I wanted to give that a try with the Fuji as well. And the tracking works great. So there was two ways, and this on day one, that I used the camera that worked well for me. The first way is I just locked the focusing point into the center. I don't know if you can see it there, but it's on the center square. And then I composed from the center square. And then if you hit the button halfway and recompose, if you're in tracking, it will track. So that means if I was taking pictures of, say, people walking down the street, I could point the camera, middle focusing point at them, hit the shutter button halfway, and then it would lock on, and then I can recompose and take the photo. So I did either that, or I would just hit the joystick here. So you have the little dedicated joystick on the Fuji. If you press that, then all the AF points will pop up. Let's see if it'll show you. I don't know if you can see that on the video, but all the AF points pop up. Can we see them? There you go. And then you can use the joystick to pick the focusing point you want. So I was doing one or the other method, and both worked well. One weird thing that happened is that sometimes when I would do that and select the focusing point, it would almost go back to like a single point focusing. I'm not sure why it would do that. I think it might have something to do with the face tracking, but it did have the face tracking enabled. And I would say mostly for someone who hasn't used this system at all, like for a day one use of the system, it worked really well. I found it to be a little bit challenging here and there, trying to get it to be where I wanted it as far as where it was focusing, not because of the speed of the autofocus system, but just not knowing how to use it that well. But overall, I was very, very pleasantly surprised. I did find that sometimes I wasn't sure how to change a setting to get it to where I want it to be. So I definitely need to do some more learning on the autofocus system in the camera. But overall, it worked really great. I was impressed. I got a lot of great shots. One thing that really, really impressed me a lot too was that I was able to take pictures in very dark circumstances, almost pitch black in the viewfinder, and it would focus perfectly, and the pictures came out great. So I was really pleasantly surprised by that as well. Let's talk for a second about film simulations. Obviously, this is one of Fuji's strong points. Everybody loves their film simulations, and I knew this would be something I loved about the camera too. And I tried basically all of them out, more or less, and I was very happy with the results I got. I think my favorite film simulations, definitely Velvia is great. It did a great job when it got dark out and I was shooting, say, street lights and car lights and different things like that. It really looked cool to have that little bit more of saturation. I really enjoyed the classic chrome and the classic neg simulations as well. It gives you this sort of old school look with a lot of depth, and it's not overly saturated at all. But my favorite mode to use, going back to my old X Pro 1, is the monochrome mode. Now what this camera has that the X Pro 1 didn't have is the other black and white mode that's called Acros. I gave that a try, and I found that I really liked the results I was getting with Acros and the R filter. One of the things that really impressed me is the JPEGs. Not only do they just look great, but the blacks are really a nice, true, pleasing black. And even using the higher ISO settings, you're not going to see a lot of noise. So I really enjoyed it. I still think that that's some of the best, most fun way of shooting with a Fuji camera is in the monochrome mode. And now that I have the Acros, I think I might like that even better, but I tried both and I was very happy with the results. And it was a lot of fun to shoot. And the way I have the camera set is I have two cards in it. And I have card 1 was taking RAW and card 2 was taking JPEGs. So basically what I did was I took out card 2 and downloaded the JPEGs, and I didn't really bother with any of the RAW files. I did with a couple of them just to see if I edited it in RAW, what it would be compared to the JPEGs. And I found that the JPEGs are very, very close, and it's really something that you can just take the photos and just use the JPEGs, and they're gonna look good. So I really enjoyed that. This is also cool because the Fuji app, which I downloaded to my phone, it's super easy to just download the images. You don't have to like manually connect to a Wi-Fi setting. You just turn the camera on, turn the app on, they connect, and then you can download the images to your phone. So if you're looking just to take some really good JPEGs and post them to Instagram or something like that, that's awesome. You're gonna be able to do that and you're gonna really get great results. My biggest critique of the camera out shooting for the first day has to be the EVF. Now the EVF is good, it works really well, you could see everything really well, but my critique is that what I see in the EVF after I take the photo is not the same as what I see on the screen. Now, with my old X Pro 1, one of the things I love about that camera is what you see is what you get. So if you look through the EVF, you take that picture, it looks exactly the same on the screen on the camera, and it looks exactly the same when you download it into your computer. So probably the biggest thing that threw me off with the XT4, especially as it got darker out, was I would see a nice contrasty dark scene in the EVF, but then when I took the picture, what popped up on the back LCD screen of the camera was much flatter and less contrasty. So I didn't like that because I want it to look, I'm using it set to preview exposure mode, which means that the camera, as you adjust the aperture and shutter speed, you're seeing it change in the LCD or in the EVF. And so I like to shoot with the camera up to eye level, and seeing something that looked different to me really threw off how I was using the camera. Because I like to, more or less, I'm not looking at the meter really, I'll use it as a guide, but then I'm really eyeballing it. And I find that's one of the best ways to use this kind of a camera. So what I did is I didn't change anything during the day of the shoot because I didn't want to be fiddling with menus, but I did the next day lower the brightness of the EVF, and it seems like that's made it a little bit better. But if you've come across this issue and you have a fix for it, please let me know in the comments, because right now that's my biggest critique of the camera in general. I want the EVF to look exactly like what I take on the screen. Otherwise, it's going to affect the way I compose, and it's going to affect the settings I use. So that was a little challenging. It wasn't like a make or break, but it's definitely something that either I got to get used to it more, or maybe now that I've changed that setting, it's going to be better, but time will tell. But that's something to keep in mind. I was a little surprised by that too, because my 10-year-old X Pro 1, like I said, doesn't have that issue. So I think maybe it's a setting I have. We'll see. I think as I get to know the camera more, I'll be able to figure that out better. Now, one complaint I have to Fuji is that you spend all this money on a camera and they don't even give you a legitimate battery charger. So that kind of annoys me. You get this camera and it basically comes with a plug, you know, a USB-C cable with a plug adapter, and you got to charge the battery in the camera. So I immediately ordered another battery and charger, but I didn't have it in time for my shoot. So I went out with a fully charged battery, and again, We got off the train probably around 2 o'clock. We walked all around for maybe 5, 6 hours, and the battery lasted somewhere between 5 and 5.5 hours. So I know a lot of people say, oh, the battery life is great on this camera. And as some of you might know, this is a bigger battery than the older Fuji camera. So even the X-T3 had a smaller battery. So it's definitely going to be much better than the smaller battery in the older cameras. But I was a little surprised that by the end of the day, it was in the red and it basically died before I finished my shoot. I thought it would last the entire time shooting. It almost did, so I'm being a little critical maybe, but I wish it would have lasted a little bit longer. Now, no discussion of a Fuji camera would be complete without talking about the handling. So my first impressions with using this camera, day one, it handles great. One of the reasons I wanted an X-T4 and why I love the Fuji system as well in general is because you get actual dials. I love having an aperture ring. I love having a shutter speed dial. And what my X Pro one didn't have that this has, which I really found myself loving immediately, is a ISO dial. Now, this is so great for street photography because as the scenes are changing rapidly, you can just quickly spin this dial and change your ISO setting. And I'm not a big fan of auto ISO. I know a lot of people use that setting, but I like to be in control of the ISO. So I'm usually gonna have it set where I want it. And what I found was that, say you go down one street and it's very dark, right? And now I'm talking about primarily shooting at night at this point. I just was easily able to spin that dial, use a very fast ISO, get a great shot. Then I go on to another street and there's a ton of street lights and there's other kind of building lights and whatever. You can quickly just dial it back down. So I really, really like the ISO dial. Handling in general is awesome. The camera feels great. It's got sort of that classic SLR feel, which is what people like about it too. And I really like having those dials. The menus, on the other hand, still are not that intuitive. It's a big improvement from my older Fuji camera, but I still find the menus to be a little bit kind of clunky in the way you have to find things and set them. Now, the reason why that's not such a big issue with Fuji cameras like the X-T4 is because I can do so much without going into a menu that it doesn't necessarily become something that's precluding you from getting a great shot. So what I mean by that is, since I can control the aperture, the shutter speed, the ISO, the drive mode, exposure compensation, all of that can be done with a dial, which means you don't have to access the menus as much. So I don't think it's a make or break, but I still feel like Fuji's got a way to go to make their menu system really as intuitive as some of the other brands. Now, I've watched a ton of reviews about the X-T4, and I know that there's pretty divided camp when it comes to the flip-out LCD screen. I never thought of it as something that would be a make or break for me. In fact, the reason why I wanted the X-T4, one of the primary reasons, is because I wanted the flip-out LCD screen to do video, to do vlogging, and that sort of thing. What I realized, though, is that for street photography, the tilt screen in the older cameras, I think, is a better option. Again, this is not like a make or break, but I understand why some Fuji shooters are upset about this flip out screen and prefer the X-T3 with the tilt screen. So you need to do all of that and kind of get it here when you're just trying to shoot at waist level. And so now you have this screen sticking out, which isn't as compact. And it takes more time to do that to just get the shot you want. So I kind of see how having a tilt screen would be preferable for street photography, where you're trying to be discreet, you don't want to disturb people, and if you just are able to flip the screen out and take a few shots, it's definitely going to be faster than having to flip it out this way and do that. And now obviously you're making the profile of the camera larger. So I get that. I still prefer the flip screen. you know, the fully articulated screen over the tilt though, but I understand why some people don't. One other thing I'll say is I found that a lot of times when I tried to use it this way, the screen would shut off. And I was wearing, you know, it was cold out that day, so I'm wearing a jacket and a scarf, and the camera was just, even though it was at like a normal waist level, and a distance, I should say, from my body, the screen was off because the eye sensor was activating. So I found that a little bit jarring. Now this is also something of a, I think, a generational thing, because I come from, you know, growing up on manual SLRs and rangefinder cameras. So I still primarily will shoot with the camera up at eye level. So 99% of the time, I just have the screen set like that, and I'm gonna shoot this way. And that's how I like to use the camera. So for that, it's awesome. I didn't have any trouble there, but that was my experience at first with the screen. I'm sure as I use the camera more, I'm gonna also adjust how I use the screen and figure out better ways to make it work for me. But for day one, I found myself just keeping the screen, you know, flipped into place and using it more or less that way. So there you go. Those are my first impressions shooting with an X-T4. Day one, never using it before. Overall, I was very happy with it. I think it's a great camera. I'd give it, say, an 8 out of 10 if I had to give it a score. There's definitely room for improvement, at least for me, learning how to use the camera. I think once I spend more time with it, I'll have a much better idea of how to set the camera for specific situations. But definitely let me know in the comments below if you have an X-T4, you've used it for street photography. How have you set your camera? I'd really love to know what settings you found work best for you. And as always, please hit the like button and subscribe to my channel. Share this video with your friends. And that's it for today. So I'm looking forward to the next one. Everybody, have a great day, and I'll see you next time. Bye.